of Infrastructure at Cbus, and she's responsible for managing $5.5 billion portfolio. She has 20 years in private markets of corporate finance and investment management experience with a focus on infrastructure. She has studied in 3 continents, including Cambridge, and has previous experience at KPMG and Credit Suisse. We obviously think it's very important as Cbus, as the industry fund representing the building and construction industry, it is great that they are supporting infrastructure through both direct investment and also through Cbus Property. Without further ado, please welcome Diana from Cbus.
Good afternoon. I'd like to kick off by acknowledging Hedley Davis, the President of the NBA. I'd also like to acknowledge the NBA representatives on the Cbus board and our investment committee, who I work with very closely on developing and implementing the infrastructure strategy. I'd also like to thank Danita and the NBA board for the opportunity to address the summit today, of which Cbus is a proud sponsor. As Danita said in her opening remarks, at this same event last year, the 2 keynote speakers were Scott Morrison, then Treasurer, and Anthony Albanese, the Shadow Minister for Infrastructure. Of course, today, these 2 speakers are Prime Minister and Leader of the Opposition, respectively. It's certainly been an eventful year in politics. Similarly, the year has been of change for financial markets and financial institutions. It's been a pivotal year for Cbus. We've reached $50 billion of funds under management, doubling in size over 5 years. Post the conclusion of the Hayne Royal Commission, we've had net inflows of $1.5 billion. Australians now understand that Cbus and other industry super funds are the nation's leading purpose and values-driven investment houses. The evidence is clear. Our returns over 10 years have averaged 9.3%. We also manage over 15% of our funds in-house, and this is set to grow to 30% until 2023. I'll just now do a little disclaimer on behalf of our Legal and Compliance Department. Obviously, past returns are not necessarily indicative of future returns. Now, this exceptional performance would not have been possible without the leadership of our board. And as many of you know, our board is made up of equal representation from employers and members from the employers and unions from the building and construction industry. We are in a good position for the future in terms of delivering on infrastructure objectives and our broader investment objectives with our board composition. The macroeconomic outlook is also for change. I think many of you will be aware that the forecast is for long-term subdued inflation. At the same time, accommodative policy settings are providing a scenario which is termed as lower for longer, meaning lower returns, lower interest rates for a longer period of time. Today, I'm just going to give you an overview of the way that we're thinking about infrastructure within our portfolio within the lower for longer environment. First, I'll provide some context around infrastructure as an asset lifecycle and its evolution. I'll then talk you through what our strategy is, and then finally, I'll talk you through the role of infrastructure in the lower for longer environment. So using a typical business life cycle analogy of startup, growth and maturity, infrastructure is in the growth phase. By way of comparison, the Australian equity markets have been in existence for approximately 160 years. Infrastructure has only been around for 25 years. Australians were the pioneers in infrastructure investment in the late 1990s with the privatisation of the Australian airports. And up until 2008, there was limited global capital coming into infrastructure. However, since then, as you can see in this graph, from 2008 to 2018, there has been a significant amount of growth of capital coming into infrastructure. In fact, it is more than quadrupled over this period of time, from approximately $120 billion to over $520 billion Our view is that this growth is set to continue. Sophisticated investors, such as the Australian, Canadian and Dutch pension funds, have infrastructure allocations between 10 and 15%, but the global average is only 5%. Indeed, the Japanese pension fund, which has US $1.5 trillion of funds under management, only has $2 billion invested in infrastructure. They have publicly stated they intend to grow this to 5%. That takes it up to $75 billion. So some of you are probably sitting there thinking, well, we've just heard there's a great demand from capital for infrastructure investment, and we know there's an infrastructure deficit. Why aren't these supply and demand dynamics coming together and projects being delivered? So the short answer is, yes, there is interest from institutional capital in greenfield infrastructure projects. However, there are a number of constraints. The three key ones are scale, cost of bidding, and of course, risk allocation. You could have a contract value of $6 billion, but once you go through the capital structure for a grant, finance, equity may only be $200 million. And of that, it's typical that there could be 4 equity sponsors you're sharing that with. So it's $50 million. At the same time, to participate in that competitive auction, it can cost you between $6 to $8 million. So $6 to $8 million at-risk bid costs and only $50 million investment. We compare that to a mature infrastructure asset, let's say $500 million, so 10 times the size. We can participate in that bid auction for the same cost. So there's an issue with scalability and the cost of bidding. Risk allocation. Many of you in this room will be very aware of the issues with risk allocation. In fact, the Financial Times recently published a statistic that between 2000 and 2005, Australian contractors lost $6 billion on mega projects due to risk allocation, including PPPs. But Australia is not alone. This is also an issue in Canada and in Sweden, where we've seen SNC-Lavalin and Skanska both publicly declare that they are withdrawing from the PPP market. So why has this occurred? Quite simply, too much risk has been taken from the public sector and put onto the private sector. And the reason why this has occurred is because of the fierce competition, particularly capital, of winning those projects. Notwithstanding those challenges, we believe that Cbus and other industry super funds are uniquely placed to partner with governments to deliver more infrastructure projects to the market. We are differentiated capital, we're long-term, and we have strong community alignment. In fact, we only exist for our community, for our members. So to the extent that governments do want to come and speak to us, we are very interested to work with them to deliver more infrastructure projects into the market. Now, within the context of a fierce amount of capital chasing only a few projects and a few brownfield transactions, it's critical that we have a well thought out and well executed strategy. 3 years ago, our Board and Investment Committee approved building an internal team to deliver what we call the hybrid strategy. Essentially what the hybrid strategy is building internal capability and capacity that enables us to either directly invest or to invest through fund managers. We're agnostic in terms of what approach we take, always doing what's best for members and member outcomes. In terms of prioritising investment opportunities, we start with our portfolio and portfolio construction. Our portfolio is split into 3 clusters, which are defined by the risks of the underlying assets within the portfolio. We have a defensive cluster, we have a ballast cluster, and we have a growth cluster. Once we determine which cluster we would like to get more exposure for, we prioritise our opportunities according to 5 broad principles. These are aligned partners with common objectives, scalability, areas where Cbus has a value add or value differentiation, attractive terms that drive best value for money for members, and finally, accountability. I'm pleased to say that 3 years later, there is evidence of successful outcomes from the implementation of our strategy. We've outperformed our benchmark by 4.5% per annum over the 3 years. We've also saved members $16 million in investment costs. This is only 20% of the $78 million that the broader investment team has saved for our members, money straight into their pockets. We've also completed our first 2 direct investments in Australia and offshore, Bright Energy Investments and Forth Ports. So notwithstanding the challenges and the competition within the market, we're well placed with our strategy to deliver on our infrastructure investment return objective. As I said earlier, we are in uncertain times. It's what we call a black swan event. There is no precedent times from an economic perspective that we have been in before. We're in the 11th year of a bull market for the US equity market. We're facing a period where it's widely forecast there's going to be long-term subdued inflation and GDP growth, and there's going to be more volatility in the equity markets. This produces a number of challenges for institutional investors such as Cbus. The low interest rate environment means returns on cash and fixed income is lower than its historical been. And this is a challenge for our members entering retirement or in conservative cash options. Within this context, we're proposing to our investment committee to increase the allocation of infrastructure from 11% to 13%. This is $1 billion. And the reason that we are recommending this is because of the cash flow characteristics of infrastructure and its performance through cycle. Because infrastructure is traditionally a provision of an essential services, it has low demand elasticity, which means that it can create these positive cash flows. Based on our analysis, making this move of increasing the infrastructure allocation results to an extra $350 million to our members over 10 years. So while not a panacea, infrastructure will play a very important role in Cbus's portfolio, particularly as we enter such uncertain times going forward. Thank you very much for the opportunity to provide you with some insight of our infrastructure strategy and the role it will play going forward. And thank you once again to the MBA representatives on the Cbus Investment Committee, who I look forward to working with going forward and into the future. Do you want to do Q&A?
Okay, we actually have time for Q&A with Diana, which I think, given the interest in infrastructure, is a great opportunity to pick her brain. So, Diana, we've had a lot of discussion this morning around infrastructure, and we know how important it is for economic growth. Cheeky question, but do you think the government needs to be spending more on infrastructure, not just the super funds?
That is a cheeky question. So, I mean, we're obviously not government and we wouldn't put ourselves forward to tell them what they should do. But I can tell you from an investment perspective, we're certainly encouraging it. It is well understood and accepted that infrastructure works as a supply side stimulus for the economy, creating jobs. And as long as the projects that are prioritised have very positive benefit cost outcomes, they should provide productivity benefits into the long term. So it's a well-trodden path to use it as stimulus when the economic outlook is not favourable, and there's been strong evidence that it does in the long term increase and provide productivity gains.
Our members always get frustrated that we hear lots of announcements on project investment, regardless of who the funder is, and then would like to see it fast-tracked so we can actually get shovel organised. But why do we have those bottlenecks in terms of the concept of a project and then the reality of actually getting onto the ground? You know, from your experience, how do we sort of deal with some of those hurdles?
Bureaucracy. I mean, that's the simple answer, and it's the real answer. But you know, project prioritisation is a challenge when it's you've got to deal with the federal government and also the state government. They obviously have different bodies that do prioritise projects. So you've got Infrastructure Australia, and then you've got state bodies such as Infrastructure New South Wales and others that are similar, which have separate processes. It is true that there is an element of collaboration, but our view is that it could be improved to streamline the process to get a more consensus view on which projects to move forward and to be able to move quicker. The other sort of complexity is procurement, and what method they use for procurement also can provide a constraint.
So given Cbus is going to be investing more in infrastructure, and you talk about how important procurement is, what's the approach going to be from Cbus in terms of that procurement process, both in terms of risk and local capability, but also mindful that at the end of the day, your focus is returns to members? How do we get that balance?
Yeah, so I think just sort of splitting the way that we look at it. So there's one economic view, which is really broader and it impacts the whole Australian economy, and then there's the infrastructure investment view. So from an economic perspective, both perspectives, we are very supportive of more infrastructure spend and delivery and the prioritisation of projects. We are less concerned from an economic perspective of how they are delivered. So what I mean by that is that it doesn't always have to include private finance. There are many circumstances where the government should be delivering more. To be able to do that, they need to most likely build more in-house capability. For larger projects, the go-to procurement model has been the PPP model, which does invariably lock out a whole suite of builders because of the requirements of the private financiers. So we think that there are alternative models to the traditional PPP, which is currently being used, still a PPP model, that could actually broaden out who could bid on those proposals and different structures and also different compositions. So as I said in the more formal part of the speech, the current construct is challenging for us. It's very difficult to make the economics work and really doing what is best for our members, but I believe that there is a strong opportunity for government to collaborate with superannuation funds like ourselves to actually rethink and innovate how that relationship works, which will have a broader impact on how they procurement from a contracting perspective as well.
I've got a couple more questions for Diana, but while I ask those, if anyone does want to ask a question, put your hand up. Diana, an extra $1 billion is a lot, but it's not. And there's a lot of competition in terms of finding the right product for purchase. What is the process that you go through, and is it just a domestic investment, or is Cbus also looking internationally as well?
Yeah, so we start off and decide which exposure that we want more to from our cluster perspective. It's always got to be looked at a complete portfolio perspective. And within a cluster, then there is international and local opportunities, and we quite frankly have to trade them off. It's like many of you in your business have to decide which projects are you going to go for. What do you think you're going to get the best outcome for? So it's not dissimilar to that. Obviously, the context is different, but we work. We spend a lot of time in building relationships, particularly offshore, because we have to be more reliant on relationships offshore to get brought the good opportunities. But it's not a lot of money, as you said, $1 billion. You know, we have an exposure limit of 10%, so we can write a 550 with our size at the moment. Check, we haven't done that. We don't have an exposure that size, but that is sort of the big end of town. We can go quite small as well if there's a strategic. So yeah, it's just looking at what are the different options and then deciding what is the best out of those options.
We spoke earlier about definition of infrastructure, whether it's narrow or broad.
Yeah.
How does it defined in your team? What is your team looking for when it comes to infrastructure investment?
Yeah, that's evolved. So infrastructure investment in the late 1990s, when we sort of first went in, was very much around built infrastructure, very much transport, ports, airports, roads. It's moved today to looking at the underlying characteristics, and it's really around that essential service, low demand elasticity. Some of you will be aware that the land title registries have been sold in New South Wales and Victoria, and indeed South Australia, And those acquisitions have gone into infrastructure investment buckets. So it is broader, and it's more looking at what are the characteristics than the traditional sort of built environment definition.
And I know it's not in your area, but Cbus Property, that has done extraordinarily well. How they obviously are looking at building more. Where do you think that is headed, and some of the priorities they've got going forward?
Yes, so they've been they're a great business within Cbus, something we're very proud of. Over the last year, which has obviously been quite challenging for property, they've delivered returns of 12.4%. They have a construction pipeline of $5 billion, and to sort of directly answer your question, that's very much focused on commercial and also high-end residential. Commercial's getting a lot of interest at the moment because of where the market's at, and that seems to be an area where we feel like we've got a value differentiator, and it also provides a nice diversifier from the high-end residential in terms of through cycle, because you have the long-term leases.
I'm sure that we've got probably an awful lot of Cbus members here, and I've got a question up there, so I'm going to...
This is not a question in relation to infrastructure, but with regards to the proposed initiative for an Australian business growth fund that it was proposed to look at banks and super funds investing to support Australian small business. I was just curious whether there's anything that's sort of eventuated from that, or any update, or what Cbus's position would be on that.
Yeah, apologies, but I'm not across that initiative. What I can say is that when we look at any investment initiative across any of the asset classes, we always look at what's the risk-adjusted return and what is the comparative value proposition. It's very much comparative. So the way that something like that would be assessed is what's the proposition on the table, what are the other places where we could put capital, because we obviously don't have an infinite amount of capital, and then see how that ranks. And if it's attractive and there's other aspects to it, probably move something like that forward.
Time for one last question. Yes.
Hello, Diana. Thanks for that very interesting presentation. Shane Garrett from Cbus Australia. This might be a little bit outside your scope, so apologies if it is. But do you see any role for superannuation funds in either supporting infrastructure for housing specifically, or for the delivery of affordable housing?
Again, we're certainly very interested. We are invested through the NIFIC on the bond aggregator, which was spoken earlier about. Again, it goes to risk-adjusted returns and where that fits in. We obviously have a sole purpose, and that's for the benefits of our members. So we always look at what is the risk-adjusted return, where else could we put that money, and then a decision is made on the relative attractiveness. Thanks.
So can everyone thank Diana for her informative